All right, it's Friday afternoon. It's been a long week, and I wanted to have a little fun talking about a fun, unexpected event in my early PhD days, which was now about 2 decades ago. So at the time, I was working on biologically or neurally inspired robot navigation with a number of colleagues and my supervisor, Gordon. We were working on a system called RatSLAM. So SLAM is an acronym in robotics, which stands for Simultaneous Localization And Mapping. And basically it's the problem or challenge of a robot moving around in a new environment, creating a map of that environment or mapping the environment whilst simultaneously keeping track of where it is located in that environment. It's one of the key challenges in the entire robotics field. A lot of the key work was done 25 years ago, but it's continued on as one of the key problems in robotics. One of the ongoing jokes is that SLAM is solved, but everyone is still working on it. Anyway, our system was RatSLAM. It was called RatSLAM because it was based on what was then understood about these mapping and navigation systems in the brain of animals like rats, and as has since been discovered, probably in the brains of many mammalian species, including humans. Anyway, I was working on a Pioneer 3DX, I think, robot. This is one of those black and red, medium-sized mobile robots that you would have seen in robotics labs all around the place, all around the world. And these robots were very good for research at the time. You could run a computer on them, you could put all sorts of sensors on them, and they were a workhorse of robotics research at the time, especially in areas like SLAM. Anyway, I was in a mixed lab. We had a shared lab space and office space with maybe 4 or 5 other PhD candidates, maybe a postdoc. We were a well-knit team. We got on fairly well. We did other things together. But we also played pranks on each other, or at least I was the recipient of or victim of a number of pranks. So one of the pranks, and I can't remember who exactly it was who played this on me, was someone without my knowledge stuck I think it was some black tape onto the camera of my Pioneer robot. So this was a pan, tilt, zoom camera that was the robot's main source of sensory input. This was the sensor that the robot used to keep track of where it was in the world, to do the mapping part of SLAM, and also to work out when it was visiting a place in the map that it had been before, because then it could tell or calculate it was at that location in the map. Anyway, from what I recall, and this was a while ago, my lab mates were very excited, waiting for me to run the experiment and waiting for me to wonder what the heck was going wrong because none of the systems were working. But to their surprise, and initially afterwards my surprise, even when I was told what was going on, we ran the RatSLAM mapping and navigation system on the robot as the robot moved around the office building and the lab space, and the system pretty much worked the same as it always had been. So I didn't really notice immediately any difference, and so I didn't twig that there was tape over the camera, and I think my lab mates actually had to tell me that they'd played the prank because I wasn't able to detect it otherwise. I would have eventually realized, of course, when I looked at the robot. And one of the interesting things that you could never predict ahead of time that came out of that, which has really been a small but significant contribution to my entire career, was that I looked at why the system had still worked. And so for a visual SLAM system, you really need 2 sources of sensory input. You need sensory input that tracks or the motion or velocity of the vehicle or the platform or the robot and works out how far you've moved. But you also need a sensor like a camera, it could be a LiDAR sensor on a modern autonomous vehicle, that is able to scan the environment where you are and work out if that is a part of the environment you've been before. Basically by comparing the current camera image or current LiDAR scan to the reference map that you've already obtained of that environment. And this is a process called loop closure or visual place recognition or localization, depending on the particular method that you use. So we dug into what was happening, and we realized that although there was tape over the lens of the camera, the tape was not a complete blackout tape. So it still let through some average intensity of light. It just ruined any ability to discern what was actually in the image. So basically it turned this 640 by 480 resolution camera, this is what we were working with at the time, into a single pixel sensor that essentially detected the brightness of the environment where the robot was positioned. Now, in an indoor office environment, the lighting and brightness is relatively consistent, at least for over short periods of time. And so if you take a recording at a certain location and the brightness intensity could be anywhere from 0 to 255, you might get a recording of, say, 133. And if you come back to that exact same location with the camera pointed in exactly the same orientation, and you take another recording, you might get that same intensity reading of 133 or 132 or 134. And that intensity reading would vary as you moved through the environment. And so even though the tape had ruined any ability of the camera to pick out any details in the scene, we still had a repeatable recording of the average intensity of light at each place in the environment. And that, coupled with the fact that our SLAM system was getting its motion estimation from encoders on the wheels of the robot, meant that the SLAM system, the RatSLAM system, pretty much continued operating, at least for short periods of time, the same as it had before the tape had been applied. And so I found that really, really fascinating at the time, but several years later, we were working on a whole line of work where we were really pushing the boundaries on how much resolution you actually need from a camera sensor in a SLAM system, a visual SLAM system for a robot or an autonomous vehicle in order to do this visual place recognition or localization task. And inspired in part by this prank, we were able to show that you could actually do pretty impressive feats of visual place recognition, sometimes using cameras that literally had a single pixel, so more like a light intensity meter than an actual what you would think of as a modern camera. So it could be more like the light sensor on your phone that tells you whether your phone is up against your ear or not. And that then led on to some of the key work that we did in simple sequence-based localization or visual localization, like our SequenceLAM work, which is still my top-cited work. It won a bunch of awards or finalist awards. It's my top-cited paper with over 1,000 citations. It led to a bunch of funded research. It's been used directly or indirectly in a number of follow-on applied projects. So it was a really pivotal career breakthrough in terms of research. Now, I wouldn't attribute it entirely to that prank, but I do use that prank as an illuminating example of how sometimes when you do something very unexpected in your research work for your experiments, it's worth paying a little bit of attention to what is actually happening and trying to explain it, rather than just immediately dismissing it as a wasted experiment and trying to fix it in the next one. Most of the time, it will be a waste of time, but sometimes you'll gain some critical, completely unexpected insights into your research, and sometimes that can be a career-defining breakthrough. It doesn't happen very often, that's the nature of the research field, but when it does, it's such a joyful, exciting, illuminating moment that it's very much worth keeping an eye out for, even though it's rare. Anyway, that's my story for this Friday afternoon. I hope you found it enjoyable and perhaps relevant to how you do your research, and I hope you have a great weekend.